Get that transmission stabilized now. I don't care if it fries the whole array. Admiral Kael Orion's voice cut through the tense air of the Vanguard command deck, sharp as a blade. The flickering hologram hovered before them, a fractured image of a battered alien vessel drifting aimlessly in the black expanse near Saturn. Sparks danced in the air as the decoding crew struggled to piece together the dying ship's final message. "Transmission stabilized, sir," an ensign called, his hands trembling as he worked the controls. The hologram solidified, revealing the ship's emblem, a twisted sigil of the Galactic Empire. Kael's jaw tightened. "Play it," he ordered. The bridge fell silent. The crackle of static resolved into desperate words, each syllable laden with agony. Experiment, failure, human, children, dispose, waste. The message ended abruptly, as if the ship's systems had collapsed under the weight of its own betrayal. The crew stood frozen, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Kael stepped forward, his boots striking the metal deck with deliberate precision. His storm-gray eyes scanned the stunned faces before returning to the sigil on the hologram. "Every second we waste is another second those monsters think they've won. Get me intelligence. I want everything on that ship and its last known trajectory." The urgency in his tone snapped the crew back into action. Fingers flew over consoles, data streams pouring across holographic displays. Commander Alden Voss leaned against the railing, his broad shoulders stiff with anger. "Children, Kael. They're experimenting on kids. What kind of twisted species does that?" "The kind that believes they can break humanity," Kael replied, his voice low and seething. "They think they can play God. We'll remind them what happens when gods bleed." Within hours, Kael stood in the hangar bay, the cavernous space humming with activity. Ships gleamed under harsh lights as engineers prepped them for rapid deployment. He approached Dr. Elias Trent, who was hunched over a terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. "Tell me you've got something," Kael said. Trent didn't look up. "The wreck's trajectory puts it in proximity to an uncharted system, possibly an Empire research facility. They must have panicked when something went wrong and ditched the evidence." Kael's hand clenched into a fist. "Evidence? Those were children, not data points." Trent finally looked up, his usually calm face shadowed with grief. "I know, Admiral, and if my calculations are correct, this was one of many. The scale of their operations is staggering." Kael inhaled deeply, forcing himself to focus. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. "We move now. Prep the strike team. I want to be there when we tear that facility apart." The sleek black frigate, Resolute, emerged from Saturn's shadow like a predator stalking its prey. Its sensors swept the void, locking onto the drifting wreck. The ship's interior buzzed with anticipation, every crew member poised for what lay ahead. Kael stood on the bridge, flanked by Voss and Trent. The air was thick with tension, the kind that pressed on your chest like a vice. "Approaching the wreck," a helmsman reported, his voice steady despite the weight of the mission. "Visual range in 30 seconds. Kael nodded. "Voss, take point. I want you and your squad ready to board the moment we dock." "Aye, sir." Voss turned, his voice barking orders into his comm as he marched toward the airlock. Trent watched him go, then turned to Kael. "You realize this could be a trap?" Kael's gaze remained fixed on the approaching wreck. "Good. Let them try." The wreck loomed larger, its jagged edges and scorched hull telling a story of desperation and violence. When the Resolute docked, Voss and his team moved with precision, their boots clanging against the metal as they entered the derelict vessel. "Stay sharp," Voss said, his rifle sweeping the corridor. The air was heavy, carrying the tang of burnt circuitry and something else. Something colder, metallic, like the remnants of fear made physical. "Admiral," Voss's voice came through the comm. "We found the lab." Kael's heart thudded in his chest. "Report." "It's worse than we imagined." Kael left Trent to oversee the bridge and strode to the airlock. Minutes later, he stepped into the wreck, the dim emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The lab was a chamber of horrors. Broken glass vials littered the floor, their contents staining the metal in sickly hues. Pods lined the walls, their interior shattered, the remnants of something once alive now long gone. Kael's eyes landed on a table in the center of the room. Its surface was scarred with grooves, as though something had clawed at it in futile desperation. He approached slowly, his boots crunching over debris. "This isn't science," he said, his voice a cold fury. "This is barbarism." Voss gestured to a nearby console, its screen still flickering weakly. "We pulled what we could. The logs mentioned something about genetic adaptation experiments, an attempt to suppress what they called human unpredictability." Kael's breath hitched. "Unpredictability? They fear us because we don't conform to their precious algorithms. They fear us because we survive," Voss said. Kael's jaw tightened. "Not just survive, thrive." Back on the Resolute, Kael convened his senior officers in the war room. Holographic displays filled the space with data extracted from the wreck. Trent gestured to a series of star charts. "The logs mention a research station in this sector. It's isolated, heavily guarded, and unregistered in any known system. If they've been conducting these experiments, this is where we'll find the answers." Kael's gaze swept over the room. "We're not just looking for answers. We're looking for justice, and we're going to make damn sure the galaxy knows what happens when humanity is pushed too far." Voss smirked, his usual bravado creeping back into his voice. "I take it subtlety isn't the plan?" "Subtlety is a tool," Kael replied. "Vengeance is the message." As the Resolute prepared for its next jump, Kael stood in his quarters, staring at the stars beyond the viewport. The vastness of space had always seemed indifferent, but now it felt charged, alive with the weight of what was to come. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Trent stepped in, holding a datapad. "Admiral, there's one more thing." Kael turned, his expression expectant. "The genetic data we recovered, it's incomplete, but there's something strange. The children, they weren't just experiments, they were evolving." Kael's brow furrowed. "Evolving how?" Trent hesitated. "I don't know yet. But whatever it was, it terrified the Empire enough to kill them all." Kael's fists clenched at his sides. "Then they've given us another reason to fear us, and it's time we remind them why they should." The stars beyond the viewport burned with cold indifference, a silent chorus to the storm brewing in Admiral Kael Orion's mind. The revelation from the derelict ship still throbbed in his thoughts, a raw wound that refused to close. He stood in the command deck of the Resolute, arms folded, gaze locked on the infinite void. Behind him, Commander Alden Voss leaned on the railing, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor. "You're thinking about the kids, aren't you?" His voice was low, stripped of its usual sharpness. Kael didn't turn. "They didn't just kill them, Alden. They erased their futures, erased what they could have been. That's worse than murder. That's annihilation." Voss exhaled through his teeth, stepping closer. "And we're going to make them pay for every single one of those futures. But we can't do it alone. We need allies." Kael finally turned, his gray eyes hard as steel. "Then let's find some." The Resolute glided into the orbit of Titan's largest settlement, its arrival unannounced yet unmistakable. The ship's gleaming surface reflected the harsh glow of industrial lights below, casting sharp beams that pierced the dark methane clouds. Inside the council chamber, Kael faced a wall of skepticism. The representatives seated around the table were seasoned diplomats and power brokers, their expressions a mosaic of wariness and calculation. Representative Leoran, a wiry man with hawk-like features, leaned forward. "Admiral, do you realize what you're asking? A direct confrontation with the Empire is a death sentence. They'll retaliate with enough force to turn Earth into ash." Kael's voice cut through the room like a blade. "If we wait, they'll destroy us anyway. This isn't just about Earth. It's about every species under their rule. They experiment on us because they fear us. Imagine what they'll do to you once we're gone." Leoran's eyes narrowed. "Bold words, Orion, but words don't win wars." Kael stepped closer to the table, his movements deliberate, his presence casting a long shadow over the gathered representatives. "No, they don't, but alliances do. And here's the truth you're all too afraid to admit. If we don't stand together now, there won't be a galaxy left worth saving." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing against the thick air. From a corner, Dr. Elias Trent cleared his throat, his voice quieter but no less firm. "We've intercepted logs that show just how far the Empire's experiments have gone. Their fear of humanity isn't just paranoia, it's strategy. They fear what we could become if left unchecked." A murmured ripple passed through the room, and Kael seized the moment. "I'm not asking you to march into battle blind. I'm asking for resources, intelligence, and support. Let Earth take the brunt of the fight. We've prepared for this far longer than you think." The council erupted into whispers, but Kael held his ground. He didn't flinch under their scrutiny, didn't falter when the questions grew sharp. He could feel the tide shifting, not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet, incremental momentum. It was a war of persuasion, and Kael knew how to fight it. As the meeting concluded, Leorin stopped him by the door, his hawkish gaze studying Kael with new depth. "You're either the bravest man in this galaxy or the most reckless. Either way, I'll consider your proposal." Kael didn't smile, didn't thank him. He simply nodded. "I'll take brave." Back aboard the Resolute, Kael found Voss in the armory, checking the alignment of his plasma rifle. "So, how did the politicking go?" Voss asked without looking up, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. Kael leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Better than expected, worse than I'd hoped." Voss snorted, the sound sharp in the sterile quiet of the room. "Diplomats love their posturing. Give me a clean firefight any day." Kael's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "You'll get your chance soon enough. For now, we need to focus on the next target." "Which is?" Kael straightened, his expression darkening. "The Archon Syndicate. They've got the resources we need, but they're as likely to stab us in the back as they are to join us." Voss grinned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Sounds like my kind of people." The Resolute descended into a sprawling asteroid belt where the Syndicate's stronghold lay hidden. The journey through the belt was treacherous, the ship's shields shimmering under the strain of debris strikes. Kael watched from the bridge, his fingers gripping the edge of the console as the Resolute wove through the chaos with surgical precision. "Contact with the Syndicate established," a comms officer reported. "They're granting docking clearance, begrudgingly." "Of course they are," Kael muttered, his tone dry. "Prepare the boarding team." Voss and his squad disembarked first, their armored boots ringing on the metallic docking platform. The air in the Syndicate's lair was heavy, with a metallic tang, mingled with the faint vibration of machinery thrumming deep within the rock. The atmosphere was oppressive, like the world itself was waiting for violence to erupt. Kael followed, his presence commanding yet restrained. The Syndicate's leader, a towering figure named Dravik, met them in a dimly lit chamber filled with holographic displays. His scarred face twisted into a smirk. "Admiral Orion, to what do we owe the pleasure of Earth's finest?" Kael didn't waste words. "I need your ships, your weapons, and your intelligence." Dravik's laughter was a low, rumbling thing, like distant thunder. "Bold, coming into my den with demands." "It's not a demand," Kael replied evenly. "It's an offer. The Empire won't stop at Earth. You know that as well as I do. Join us, and you'll be on the winning side when this war ends." Dravik's expression hardened. "And if I refuse?" Kael stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Then you'll still end up fighting the Empire. The only difference is, you'll be doing it alone." The tension in the room crackled, a silent standoff that felt poised on the edge of eruption. Finally, Dravik leaned back, his smirk returning. "You've got nerve, Orion. I like that. Fine. You've got my support. For now." As Kael and his team returned to the Resolute, Voss glanced at him, his grin unapologetically cocky. "I think he likes you." Kael's expression didn't shift. "Let's hope it stays that way." The Resolute pulled away from the asteroid belt, its course set for the next waypoint. Kael stood in his quarters, staring at the star charts projected on the wall. Each point of light was a battlefield waiting to happen, a chessboard where the stakes were measured in lives. He clenched his fists, his mind already spinning with the next move. "Children evolving," he murmured, Trent's earlier words resurfacing like a ghost. Whatever the Empire feared, Kael knew it was far greater than even humanity's resilience. It was their potential, and that potential would be their weapon. The void beyond the Resolute glimmered faintly as the ship cut through a field of distant starlight, its course unwavering toward the coordinates extracted from the syndicate's intelligence. On the bridge, Admiral Kael Orion stood with his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone as he studied the data streams projected before him. The latest intercepted transmissions from the Galactic Empire had been decoded, fragments of reports that hinted at their growing awareness of Earth's movements. "We've stirred the hornet's nest," Commander Alden Voss remarked as he joined Kael. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, his usual swagger replaced with a sharp edge of tension. "They've started fortifying nearby systems. They know we're coming." Kael didn't reply immediately. His eyes lingered on the swirling display of a system map. Red markers signified Empire strongholds. Blue indicated potential allies. Between them lay a stretch of uncharted space, a blank void that whispered of secrets too dangerous to be recorded. "They'll expect brute force," Kael said finally, his voice a quiet rumble. "So we'll give them something else. Prepare a recon team. We're heading for the Direxus Nebula." Voss arched an eyebrow. "The Nebula? That's a no-man's land. No charts, no navigation beacons, and plenty of ways to die." Kael's gaze sharpened. "Which is exactly why they won't see us coming." Minutes later, the ship's command crew worked with a feverish precision. The hull groaned faintly as shields adjusted to the dense particle storms of the nebula. Sparks danced briefly along the corridors as the ship plunged into its shrouded depths. Outside, ribbons of electric blue and violent purple danced across the void, cascading like unbridled lightning. Inside the Resolute, the dimmed lights added to the tense atmosphere. The air seemed heavier here, the charged particles from the nebula affecting even the ship's internal systems. Dr. Elias Trent, perched near a data console, muttered under his breath as he adjusted readings. "You'd think they'd have built a ship that doesn't feel like it's choking in storms," Voss quipped, glancing at Trent. "What are we looking at?" Trent tapped a panel, his expression grim. "There's interference everywhere. Whatever's hiding in here doesn't want to be found." Kael entered the room, his boots muffled against the reinforced deck. "Then we're looking in the right place. What's the status on our probes?" "Deployed," Trent replied, his fingers flying over the console. "They're feeding back fragmented readings. But there's definitely something here. Metallic signatures, faint but deliberate. It's a facility." Voss grinned, though there was no humor in it. "A nice, hidden place to play God." Kael's voice sliced through the air. "Enough speculation. Bring us closer. Full stealth. I don't want so much as a whisper of our presence detected." The ship's systems adjusted with a barely perceptible shift. Kael turned and gestured to Voss. "Take your team and prepare for insertion. Trent, you're with me. We're running this operation from here." The shuttle ride down was anything but smooth. The nebula clawed at the small craft, sending shudders through its frame as the Vanguard operatives gripped their restraints. Voss sat at the front, his helmet under his arm, watching the jagged shapes of metallic structures loom closer through the storm. "This doesn't scream friendly," one of the operatives muttered, his voice tight with unease. "Good," Voss replied. "We're not here to shake hands." The shuttle touched down on an exposed platform, its landing gear groaning under the strain. Outside, the air was thick and electric, every breath charged with something unnatural. Voss and his team exited swiftly, their boots crunching against the grated surface. The facility stretched before them like a beast, its angular architecture jutting out of the rock as though it had grown there. Flickering lights lined the exterior, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Eyes open," Voss said, his voice taut. "I don't trust this place." The team moved silently, their weapons at the ready as they breached the first door. Inside, the air was colder, sterile, yet oppressive. The walls were lined with conduits that pulsed faintly, as though the facility itself was alive. "Trent," Kael's voice came through Voss's comm. "We're picking up faint biosignatures. Can you confirm?" Voss glanced at the operative scanning the area. The man nodded. Biosigns confirmed, small clusters moving slowly, probably security. Keep moving, Kael said. Find the data core. That's our priority. The deeper they ventured, the stranger the facility became. They passed rows of tanks filled with viscous green liquid, suspended within them twisted forms that barely resembled anything living. Voss's grip on his weapon tightened. This is some nightmare fuel, one of the operatives muttered. Focus! Voss snapped, though his jaw was clenched. These are just leftovers. The real monsters are the ones running this place. They reached a central chamber, its ceiling towering high above them. At the center stood a console, its screen glowing faintly with rows of alien script. Voss gestured for the team to cover the exits while he approached the terminal. Trent's voice came through the comm again, this time with urgency. Admiral, we're picking up movement. Multiple signatures converging on your position. Figures, Voss muttered as he began extracting data from the console. His fingers moved quickly, the alien interface responding sluggishly but steadily. We've got company. Hold them off while I finish this. The first shots rang out moments later, bright streaks of plasma cutting through the shadows. The operatives returned fire, their movements precise and practiced. Voss didn't look up, his focus entirely on the console. Hurry it up, Voss, one of the operatives shouted, the sharp scent of burning metal filling the air as a console behind him exploded. Almost there, Voss growled, his voice a razor's edge. Finally, the terminal emitted a sharp tone and the data crystal ejected with a soft click. Voss grabbed it and turned, his voice sharp. We're done here. Fall back. The retreat was chaotic, the team weaving through corridors as more hostiles closed in. The sound of footsteps pounding against metal and the hiss of plasma fire echoed around them, each shot carving a streak of light in the dim interior. By the time they reached the shuttle, the facility was beginning to shake. Voss shoved the data crystal into a secured slot and barked, "Get us out of here!" The shuttle lifted off, the facility shrinking behind them as the nebula's storm swallowed it once more. Back on the Resolute, Kael examined the crystal in his hands. What did we lose? Nothing important, Voss said, his breath still ragged, but we gained something big. Whatever they're doing in there, Admiral, it's worse than we thought. Kael's jaw tightened, his mind already racing with possibilities. He turned to Trent, who was scanning the data. What do we have? Trent's face darkened. Admiral, they weren't just experimenting on adaptability. They were trying to rewrite it entirely, turn it into a weakness. Kael's gaze burned like a supernova. Then we make sure they never get the chance. In the cold silence of the bridge, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on every soul aboard. Yet beneath the tension, there was a spark, a promise of what humanity could still become. Kael stood in the dim glow of the Resolute's briefing chamber, the alien data crystal casting an unnatural light as it spun within the projector. Around the table, his senior officers gathered, their faces etched with tension. The rotating hologram of intercepted information flickered and reshaped itself, maps, schematics, and fragments of alien text swimming through the air like a puzzle begging to be solved. Whatever they're doing, Dr. Elias Trent said, breaking the tense silence, it's not just about stopping us, it's about rewriting what makes us, us. Kael's gaze remained fixed on the data, his shoulders taut as steel. They're trying to control evolution, he said, strip away what they fear most, our ability to adapt. Trent nodded grimly, his hands clenched around the edge of the table. These experiments weren't failures. They were steps toward a larger goal. Whatever they were planning, this facility was just a proving ground. Which means there's more, Kael said, his voice low. Where? Trent gestured toward the map, where a cluster of alien glyphs glowed menacingly. Here, a deep space installation outside their usual territory, completely off the grid. Commander Alden Voss, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, pushed off and stepped closer. And let me guess, it's crawling with enough firepower to make this mission suicidal? Trent smirked faintly. Wouldn't be a mission worth taking if it wasn't. Kael's lips twitched in the shadow of a smile before hardening again. We're not walking into this blind. Voss, I want recon teams on the perimeter. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. Trent, decode the rest of the data. I want every inch of that installation mapped before we move. And when we do? Voss asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Kyle's voice dropped to a steely calm. We hit them so hard they'll think twice before uttering the word human again. The room dispersed, the officers moving with the quiet precision of a crew that understood the gravity of their mission. Kyle lingered, staring at the rotating glyphs as though he could will them to give up their secrets. Hours later, the Resolute coasted through the pitch-black reaches of deep space, its silhouette blending with the void. The distant pinpricks of stars were dimmed by the vast shadow of a nebula, its tendrils curling outward like a slumbering beast. In the recon bay, Voss tightened his harness as his team prepared for launch. The shuttle vibrated faintly under the adjustments, a low pulse that reverberated through the metallic frame. The air smelled faintly of coolant and burned alloy, a constant reminder of the risks they faced. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered one of the operatives, a wiry man named Dax. His voice barely carried over the quiet tension. "Good," Voss replied, slapping him on the shoulder. "Keeps you sharp." The shuttle disengaged from the Resolute with a soft shudder, slipping into the nebula's tendrils. Outside, the swirling clouds lit up in brief flashes, the volatile gases colliding with silent brilliance. As the team neared the target, the installation loomed into view, a dark, angular fortress suspended in the void, its spires bristling with weaponry. Lights blinked intermittently along its surface, like the heartbeat of a predator lying in wait. Voss's voice crackled through the comms. "This is it. Keep it quiet. We're only here to get eyes on their operation." The shuttle's engines fell silent, and it drifted closer, carried by the gravitational currents of the installation. Through the reinforced viewport, Voss caught glimpses of automated patrol drones skimming the perimeter. Their sleek forms glinted faintly, their red optics sweeping methodically. Inside the installation, the corridors were cold and unwelcoming, their walls lined with alien conduits pulsing with faint energy. The recon team moved with practiced efficiency, their boots making the barest sound against the metal. The air was sharp, carrying the faint tang of recycled oxygen mixed with something more sterile, almost clinical. Dax paused at an intersection, his visor's scanner lighting up faintly. "Multiple heat signatures, 2 levels above us." "Keep moving," Voss whispered, his tone clipped. "We're not here for a fight." They entered a central chamber dominated by a massive data core, its surface shimmering with alien script. Voss approached cautiously, his gloved hand brushing against the console's interface. The screen flared to life, illuminating the chamber with an eerie green glow. "Downloading the data now," Voss said quietly into the comm. "Trent, you better be ready to decipher this." "Always," Trent's voice replied, laced with dry humor. The screen shifted as the download progressed, revealing cryptic images and fragments of text. Voss frowned, his gaze lingering on one of the images, a detailed schematic of a human brain, overlaid with strange alien annotations. "What the hell is this?" Dax muttered, peering over his shoulder. "Something we're not supposed to know," Voss replied. "Let's finish up and get out." The sound of approaching footsteps froze them in place. Voss gestured sharply, and the team scattered, pressing themselves into the shadows. A trio of alien guards entered the chamber, their armor reflecting the green light as they scanned the room. One of the guards stopped near the console, his clawed hand reaching for the interface. Voss's fingers tightened around his weapon, his breathing steady as he watched, waiting. But before the guard could act, the download completed with a faint beep. The sound was enough. The guards spun toward the noise, their weapons raised. "Go!" Voss barked, unleashing a volley of plasma fire. The chamber erupted into chaos, the green glow replaced with the flashing light of weapons fire. The recon team moved as one, their training turning the chaotic battle into a deadly dance. "Extraction point now," Voss ordered, his voice cutting through the cacophony. The team retreated through the corridors, their movements fluid despite the pursuing guards. Back on the shuttle, the recon team slammed the hatch shut as Dax dropped into his seat, panting. "Next time, let's pick a quieter target." Voss grinned, though his expression was tight. "You're welcome to request that from Kael." The shuttle rocketed away from the installation, its cloaking systems engaging as they slipped back into the nebula. On board the Resolute, Kael waited in the war room, his arms crossed as he watched the team disembark. "What did you find?" Kael asked, his tone brisk. Voss handed over the data crystal, his face dark. "More of their twisted experiments. And Admiral, they're getting close to something big. Whatever this is, they're not just targeting humans anymore. They're trying to control the entire evolutionary playing field." Kael's jaw tightened, his mind racing as he turned to Trent. "Get me a full analysis. I want to know exactly what they're planning and how we can stop it." Trent nodded, already moving toward the lab. Kael stood alone for a moment, staring at the crystal as if it held the answers to every question plaguing him. The shadows of the war room seemed to close in around him, the weight of the mission pressing against his chest. He turned toward the viewport, where the nebula stretched out like an endless storm. "We're running out of time," he muttered to himself, and for the first time, the silence of space felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Kael stood at the center of the Resolute's war room, bathed in the cold glow of the holographic display. The data from the alien facility spilled across the air like a spider's web, maps of distant systems, schematics of weapons, and fragments of incomprehensible genetic code. Every piece was part of a larger puzzle, but its picture remained frustratingly out of focus. "Trent," Kael said, his tone a knife's edge, "you've had hours. Tell me something I don't know." Dr. Elias Trent, hunched over his console, looked up with weary eyes. "The genetic experiments we found, they weren't just designed to suppress adaptability. They were attempting to rewrite humanity at its most fundamental level. The Empire isn't just afraid of us, Admiral. They're trying to erase what makes us unique." Kael's jaw tightened. "You mean our ability to survive?" "To evolve," Trent corrected. "They're manipulating genetic codes to extinguish that adaptability, ensuring that no matter what environment we face, we'll falter. It's a preemptive extinction plan." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the revelation pressing against every man present. Commander Alden Voss broke it with his usual bluntness. "And this extinction plan, how close are they to making it work?" Trent hesitated, his fingers twitching over the console. "Closer than we'd like. The installation we infiltrated was part of a larger network. They're collecting human genetic data on a scale we've never seen before." Kael's eyes narrowed, his voice hard. "Where's the rest of the network?" Trent tapped a key, and the holographic display shifted to reveal a cluster of stars. One system was marked in vivid red. "Here, the Revax cluster. There's a command station at its heart, heavily fortified and hidden deep in a debris field. It's the linchpin of their operations." Voss folded his arms, his expression grim. "A debris field? That's not going to make this easy." "It's not supposed to," Kael said. "The debris will shield their location from scans and make any approach a nightmare." Voss smirked faintly. "Sounds like a challenge." Kael ignored the remark, his focus locked on the display. "This is their Achilles heel. If we hit that station, we cripple their ability to continue the experiments." "And if we fail?" Trent asked, his voice quiet. Kael's gaze sharpened, his tone like tempered steel. "We won't." The Resolute plunged into the outer edges of the Revax cluster, its hull sheathed in electromagnetic countermeasures to slip through the labyrinth of wreckage undetected. Outside, the stars disappeared behind the jagged silhouettes of shattered ships and twisted debris. The cluster felt alive, its fragments spinning and colliding with a malevolent rhythm as though it resented the intrusion. In the command deck, the air was thick with tension. The faint hum of power coursing through the ship resonated beneath the surface, a reminder of the thin line between stealth and exposure. Kael stood at the viewport, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Report," he said, his voice slicing through the quiet. Voss stepped forward, his boots barely audible against the deck. "Recon drones are mapping a path, but it's slow going. The debris field is denser than we anticipated." Kael's expression didn't shift. We don't have time for slow. Accelerate the mapping. Trent, stationed at a nearby console, looked up. Admiral, pushing the drones too hard increases the risk of detection. If they pick us up, they won't, Kael said sharply. The moment we hesitate is the moment we lose. Push them. Trent hesitated but nodded, his fingers flying over the console. The room descended into a tense silence as the ship crept deeper into the cluster, its sensors probing the darkness with cautious precision. Pathway identified, a tactical officer finally announced, his voice cutting through the tension. We have a clear route to the command station. Kael nodded. Voss, assemble your team. Trent, you're with me. Let's end this. The shuttle ride into the heart of the debris field was a harrowing gauntlet. Shattered hulls drifted dangerously close, their jagged edges threatening to tear through the ship's shields. Every twist and turn felt like a dance on a razor's edge, the stakes magnified by the suffocating silence of the void. Inside the shuttle, Voss checked his gear with methodical precision. His team sat in grim silence, their eyes flicking between their weapons and the viewport, where the command station loomed in the distance. Its silhouette was jagged and menacing, its surface bristling with weapon emplacements that scanned the surrounding wreckage like predatory eyes. We've seen worse, Voss said, his voice breaking the silence. Remember Rhinos Prime? That fortress made this place look like a vacation. One of the operatives chuckled dryly. Yeah, and I still have the scars to prove it. Kael, seated at the front of the shuttle, turned slightly. Focus. This isn't Rhinos. This is bigger. The team's humor evaporated instantly, replaced by steely determination. The shuttle slipped into the station's shadow, its stealth systems working overtime to avoid detection. When it finally docked, the team disembarked with the quiet precision of predators stalking their prey. Inside the station, the air was sterile and cold, carrying a faint chemical tang that clung to the back of their throats. The walls glowed faintly with the pulsing light of alien technology, casting shadows that seemed to shift and twist like living things. Stay sharp, Voss whispered, his rifle sweeping the corridor. This place doesn't feel right. They moved deeper into the station, their footsteps muffled against the smooth metal floor. The corridors twisted and turned in a maze-like pattern, each intersection feeling more claustrophobic than the last. Kael's hand hovered near his sidearm, his senses hyper-aware of every flicker of light and distant sound. Finally, they reached the command center, a massive chamber dominated by a central console that pulsed with a faint, eerie light. The walls were lined with data terminals, their screens filled with alien text that scrolled endlessly. Trent moved to the central console, his hands trembling slightly as he connected his equipment. This is it, the core of their operation. Get what you can, Kael said, his voice low, and make it fast. Trent's fingers flew over the console, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the screens. Data streams poured onto his equipment, each fragment revealing more about the Empire's plans. They're targeting more than just Earth, Trent said, his voice tinged with horror. They're collecting genetic samples from every species in their territory. They're planning to rewrite the entire galaxy. Kael's jaw tightened. Not if we stop them. Suddenly, alarms blared, their shrill cries cutting through the stillness like a blade. The room was bathed in red light as the walls began to shift, concealed weapon emplacements sliding into place. They know we're here, Voss shouted, raising his weapon. Hold them off, Kael barked. Trent, finish the download. The chamber erupted into chaos as plasma fire lit up the darkness. Voss and his team moved with deadly precision, their weapons carving through the waves of alien guards that poured into the room. Kael fired with cold efficiency, his movements calculated and deliberate. Got it! Trent shouted, yanking the data drive from the console. We need to move! Now! Kael turned, his voice cutting through the din. Fall back! Cover Trent! The team retreated through the twisting corridors, their path lit by the flashes of weapons fire. The station seemed to come alive around them, its walls pulsating with an unnatural energy as the alarms grew louder. By the time they reached the shuttle, Kael's breath was ragged, his body thrumming with adrenaline. As the shuttle lifted off, he glanced back at the station, its silhouette shrinking in the viewport. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Not even close. The Resolute tore through the void like a predator retreating into the safety of the shadows, its cloaking systems masking its presence as the debris field faded behind them. On board, the tension was palpable, a coiled spring that refused to relax. Kael stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the edge of the console as he stared at the swirling stars ahead. "Damage report," he demanded, his voice slicing through the charged air. "Minor hull breaches in the lower decks," a tactical officer responded, his tone clipped. "Shields held through the retreat. No casualties reported." Kael nodded but didn't respond. His thoughts were already on the data crystal clutched in Trent's hands. It wasn't enough to know what the Empire was planning. They had to act before the galaxy was reshaped by their cruel designs. Trent entered the bridge moments later, his face pale and drawn. The drive in his hand seemed heavier than its size suggested, its polished surface reflecting the cold light of the room. "We've cracked most of it," he said, his voice subdued. "And it's worse than we imagined." "Show me," Kael ordered, stepping back from the console. The holographic display flickered to life, projecting the decrypted data into the air. A map of the galaxy unfolded, its familiar contours now overlaid with sinister red markers. At the heart of the map was a pulsing icon, an ominous sphere surrounded by radiating lines. "That's their control nexus," Trent explained, pointing to the central icon. "Every genetic experiment, every data point collected, it all funnels here. It's their nerve center." "And the radiating lines?" Kael asked, his voice tight. "Deployment pathways," Trent replied grimly. "They're planning to release a genetic weapon, a virus engineered to target adaptability itself. It won't just suppress evolution, it'll force stagnation, locking every species into their current state." Voss, leaning against the wall, straightened at the revelation. "And let me guess, they have enough firepower around this nexus to make an assault impossible?" "Not impossible," Kael said, his voice a quiet storm. "Just unlikely to succeed." Trent hesitated, then added, "There's more. The weapon isn't fully operational. They're missing a key element, a genetic catalyst. Without it, the virus is inert." Kael's eyes narrowed. "And they're looking for this catalyst?" "They already have it," Trent said. "It's human DNA, specifically the genetic material of the children they experimented on." The bridge fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling like a physical force. Kael's hand curled into a fist, his knuckles whitening. "Then we don't have time to waste. We need a plan." In the war room, the senior officers gathered around the central table as Kael outlined his strategy. The holographic display filled the air with schematics of the control nexus, its layered defenses a daunting labyrinth of turrets, shields, and automated drones. "This isn't a mission we can brute force," Kael said, his voice measured. "The nexus is designed to repel direct assaults, but its strength is also its weakness. It relies on centralized systems we can exploit." Trent stepped forward, his expression serious. "The data indicates a single command node deep within the nexus. If we can infiltrate it and upload a virus of our own, we can disable their defenses long enough to deliver a decisive blow." "An infiltration mission?" Voss asked, a flicker of excitement in his tone. "That's more my speed." Kael shook his head. "This isn't just an infiltration, it's an all-or-nothing gambit. While the infiltration team targets the command node, the Resolute will engage the outer defenses, drawing their forces away. Timing will be everything." Voss grinned, his cocky demeanor returning. "Then we'd better make sure the timing's perfect." The days leading up to the mission were a blur of activity. The ship hummed with the quiet intensity of preparation, every crew member moving with purpose. Engineers fine-tuned the cloaking systems, technicians calibrated the weapons, and operatives trained relentlessly in the simulation chambers. Kael moved through the ship like a ghost, his presence felt in every corner. He stopped briefly at the training deck, where Voss and his team were running drills. The air crackled with the sounds of simulated gunfire and the shouts of commands. "You ready for this?" Kael asked as Voss approached, wiping sweat from his brow. Voss smirked. "Always." "Question is, are you ready to trust me with the fun part?" Kael's lips quirked in the shadow of a smile. "Just don't get yourself killed. We'll need you alive to celebrate." The Resolute emerged from its final jump on the edge of the control nexus's system, its sensors immediately picking up the sprawling fortress. The nexus was a colossal structure, its dark spires rising like jagged teeth against the backdrop of a dying star. Shields shimmered faintly around it, a near impenetrable barrier that pulsed with the energy of a small sun. Kael stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the looming target. "Commence Phase 1, he ordered. The Resolute launched a barrage of decoys, their sleek forms darting toward the nexus like fireflies. Alarms began to blare within the fortress as automated turrets swiveled to engage the perceived threat. "Phase 1 successful," the tactical officer reported. "Their outer defenses are responding as expected." "Good," Kael said. "Deploy the infiltration team." The shuttle carrying Voss and his operatives slipped through the chaos, its cloaking systems masking its approach. The interior was silent, the tension thick enough to taste. Voss checked his weapon one last time, his movements precise and deliberate. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "No second chances." The shuttle docked with the nexus, its airlock sealing with a metallic hiss. The team disembarked swiftly, their boots muffled against the polished floor. The air inside was sterile and cold, tinged with a faint metallic taste that clung to their tongues. Voss led the team through the labyrinthine corridors, their movements swift and silent. The walls pulsed faintly with the energy of the command systems, casting eerie shadows that danced with each step. "Command node ahead," Voss whispered, his voice barely audible. "Trent, we're in position." "Understood," Trent's voice crackled over the comm. "Uploading the virus now. You'll need to hold the node for 60 seconds to complete the process." 60 seconds? Voss muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Piece of cake. The team breached the command node, their weapons sweeping the room as they secured the perimeter. Voss moved to the central console, connecting Trent's device to the alien interface. The screens flared to life, lines of alien code scrolling faster than the eye could follow. 30 seconds, Trent's voice reported. The first wave of enemy forces arrived, their weapons blazing as they charged into the room. Voss and his team responded with lethal precision, the air filling with the sharp crack of plasma fire and the acrid scent of scorched metal. 10 seconds! Trent shouted. The final seconds stretched into an eternity as the room erupted into chaos. Voss ducked behind cover, his breath ragged as he fired at the advancing enemies. The console emitted a sharp tone, and Trent's voice came through the comm. "It's done! Pull out now!" Voss didn't hesitate. "Fall back!" he shouted, his team retreating in a coordinated rush. Back on the Resolute, Kael watched as the holographic display shifted. The shields around the nexus flickered and died, exposing the fortress's vulnerable core. "All weapons, fire at will," Kael commanded. The ship unleashed its full arsenal, its railguns and missiles tearing into the exposed structure with unrelenting force. The nexus shuddered as explosions rippled across its surface, its spires crumbling into the void. Kael's eyes remained fixed on the display as the fortress disintegrated. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. "They'll learn to fear us yet." The Resolute hovered on the outskirts of the crumbling nexus, its silhouette a dark sentinel against the backdrop of the now dying fortress. The final ripples of explosions flickered in the distance, the debris illuminated by the faint light of distant stars. Inside the ship, the tension on the bridge remained razor-sharp. Victory tasted bitter. The nexus had fallen, but the deeper threat lingered like a shadow in Kael's mind. Kael stood at the command console, his knuckles pressed against the surface. His eyes scanned the holographic projections of the battlefield, each element meticulously detailed. The victory here was undeniable, but it was incomplete. He straightened, turning to face his officers gathered around. "This was their command nexus," Kael began, his voice measured but firm. "But it wasn't their heart. They expected an assault here. Every defense was designed for it. This isn't where they planned to win." Dr. Elias Trent stepped forward, his hands clutching a datapad. "The deeper data we've extracted points to another location, one they've worked hard to conceal. It's buried in the Zarethis Abyss, a region marked by gravitational anomalies and natural radiation storms. This is where they've been conducting the core experiments, the place where the virus is being perfected." Commander Alden Voss, leaning against the railing with his trademark smirk, spoke up. Zarethis Abyss? Sounds like they're daring us to follow. Kael ignored the bravado and pointed to the hologram. They're not daring us. They're preparing for us. This is the endgame. If we don't act now, they'll deploy that weapon. He shifted his focus to Trent. Give me everything we know about their defenses. Trent placed the datapad on the table, the display shifting to a detailed map of the abyss. The region is naturally hostile. Navigating through the gravitational anomalies will require precise coordination. The installation itself is shielded by those natural barriers, but it's also heavily fortified, layered energy shields, turret arrays, and drone swarms that can respond within seconds. Kael studied the map, his expression impassive. How do we break through? Trent hesitated before continuing. The anomalies make traditional stealth approaches impossible. Our best option is misdirection. If we can simulate a larger fleet approaching from a different angle, it will draw their forces away from the real entry point. Kael nodded slowly. Decoys, then. What else? Voss leaned forward, his grin fading into something more serious. Their defenses are centralized, just like the nexus. If we can take out the command node, their automated systems will falter. And what about ground resistance? Kael asked, his tone sharp. They'll have troops, Trent said, but their focus is on protecting the weapon. If we target critical systems, power grids, communication hubs, it'll buy us time to infiltrate. Kael's mind raced, piecing together the threads of the strategy. Here's the plan, he said, his voice slicing through the room. The Resolute will lead the decoy assault, deploying drones and false signals to draw their attention. Meanwhile, Voss and his team will infiltrate through the Abyss's blind spot, taking out their command node and paving the way for our strike teams to disable the weapon. And once the weapon is neutralized, Trent asked. Kael's gaze darkened. We destroy the facility completely, no loose ends. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of the mission settling over them. Kael stepped back, his eyes sweeping over the room. This is our last chance to stop them. If we fail, it won't just be Earth. It'll be the entire galaxy. I expect nothing less than absolute precision. Dismissed. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Engineers swarmed over the Resolute, ensuring every system was operating at peak efficiency. Drones were programmed with false signatures, their sleek forms glinting under the harsh lights of the hangar bay. Operatives loaded their gear with methodical precision, their faces set in grim determination. In the war room, Kael met with Voss and Trent to finalize the finer details. The air crackled with tension, every word and movement charged with purpose. Once we're inside, Voss said, gesturing to the schematics of the facility, we'll need to move fast. Their automated defenses will adapt quickly, and we won't have the luxury of a second wave. Understood, Kael replied. He turned to Trent. What's the backup plan if the decoys fail? Trent hesitated before answering. If they see through the misdirection, they'll focus everything on us. We'll have to rely on the Resolute's firepower to punch a hole in their defenses. Kael's expression hardened. Let's make sure it doesn't come to that. The Resolute entered the Zarethis Abyss with the grace of a dancer threading through chaos. The gravitational anomalies tugged at the ship's hull, creating faint vibrations that resonated through the decks. Outside, ribbons of distorted light twisted and curled, a mesmerizing yet deadly display. On the bridge, Kael stood at the center, his eyes locked on the view screen. Deploy the decoys, he ordered. The drones launched in a synchronized wave, their forms scattering into the abyss. Each one emitted false signals, mimicking the energy signatures of a fleet. Kael watched as the enemy's sensor grid lit up, their defenses responding to the perceived threat. Phase 1 complete, the tactical officer reported. They're redirecting their forces. Good, Kael said. Phase 2. Voss, you're up. Voss and his team navigated their shuttle through the abyss's blind spot, the turbulence of the gravitational anomalies battering the craft. The interior lights flickered faintly as the system strained against the hostile environment. Hold it steady, Voss barked, his voice cutting through the din. His team braced themselves, their faces set with determination. The shuttle slipped through the final anomaly, emerging into the shadow of the facility, Its spires rose like jagged teeth, bristling with weaponry. The shuttle docked at an auxiliary port, its systems hissing as it latched onto the airlock. "Move!" Voss commanded, leading his team into the depths of the facility. The air was heavy and cold, carrying the faint tang of metallic dust. The corridors were dimly lit, their walls pulsing faintly with the energy of the command systems. They moved swiftly, their boots making minimal sound against the smooth floor. The command node was their primary target, its destruction the key to disabling the automated defenses. "Contact," one of the operatives whispered, his rifle snapping into position. A patrol of alien guards rounded the corner, their weapons raised. The corridor erupted into a controlled storm of plasma fire, the air crackling with heat and energy. Voss's team moved with practiced precision, their shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. The guards fell, their forms slumping against the walls. Voss didn't hesitate. "Keep moving, we don't have time to waste." They reached the command node moments later, its towering interface glowing with alien script. Voss connected the override device, his hands moving quickly as he input the sequence. "Trent, we're in position," he said into the comm. "Uploading now," Trent replied. "You'll need to hold the node for 60 seconds. The first wave of reinforcements arrived before Trent's countdown reached 30. Voss and his team dug in, their weapons blazing as they held the narrow corridor. The air grew thick with the heat of plasma fire, the walls scorched and blackened. 10 seconds, Trent shouted. The final seconds stretched into an eternity as the team fought off the relentless assault. The console emitted a sharp tone, signaling the completion of the upload. "It's done," Trent confirmed. "Pull out now." Voss didn't hesitate. "Fall back," he shouted, his team retreating in a coordinated rush. Back on the Resolute, Kael watched as the holographic display shifted. The facility's defenses faltered, their automated systems shutting down one by one. "All weapons, fire at will," Kael commanded. The ship unleashed its full arsenal, the railguns and missiles tearing into the facility's exposed structure. Explosions rippled across its surface, the spires crumbling into the void. As the dust settled, Kael stood silently, his gaze fixed on the remnants of the facility. The mission was a success, but the war was far from over. The Resolute floated silently amidst the aftermath of destruction, its shadow stretching long across the void where the Empire's facility once loomed. Fragments of the fortress drifted in chaotic spirals, illuminated by the faint light of distant stars. The final barrage had silenced the weapon, but the air on the bridge of the Resolute was heavy, not with triumph, but with grim anticipation. Kael stood at the command console, his posture rigid, his expression carved from stone. His officers worked quietly around him, their movements precise, almost mechanical. The faint hiss of cooling systems and the distant murmur of operational relays were the only sounds, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the battle moments earlier. He looked at the holographic display before him, now reduced to scattered debris fields and glowing wreckage. "We've stopped their weapon," Trent said, stepping beside him, his voice low but steady. "For now." Kael's gaze didn't shift. "For now isn't enough." Trent hesitated, his fingers gripping the data pad at his side. "We've bought time. The virus is destroyed, and their core facility is in ruins. They'll need years to recover." Kael finally turned, his eyes sharp, unyielding. "They won't get those years." The words carried a weight that silenced the bridge. Even Voss, standing at the far end of the room, straightened at the tone. "What's the next move, Admiral?" Voss asked, his usual bravado tempered by the gravity of the moment. Kael turned to the hologram, which now displayed the vast map of Empire-controlled territory. Red marks highlighted their strongholds, a network of power and control that spanned the galaxy. His finger hovered over one in particular, a central hub marked with intricate glyphs. "We strike the heart," Kael said. "The Galactic Empire isn't just a military power. It's a system of fear, held together by control and intimidation. We dismantle it piece by piece until there's nothing left." "That's a declaration of war on an unimaginable scale," Trent said quietly. "Even with the alliances we've built, the odds—" Kael's voice cut through, sharper than a blade. "We don't fight wars because the odds favor us. We fight because we refuse to bow. This isn't about survival anymore. It's about ensuring they can never do this again. To anyone. Voss stepped forward, his grin returning, though it held a fierce edge. Then let's make them regret the day they thought humanity was an easy target. Kael gave a single nod. Prepare the fleet. We move within the hour. The bridge erupted into motion. Officers relayed commands, the air thrumming with the controlled chaos of preparation. Kael remained at the console, his eyes fixed on the hologram, his thoughts racing. He could see the path ahead, each move unfolding like pieces on a chessboard. It was a game of strategy, one he intended to win. The fleet gathered at the edge of neutral space, a coalition of ships from Earth and its new allies. Their forms shimmered against the darkness, each vessel a testament to ingenuity and resilience. Kael stood in the observation deck, watching as the final preparations were made. Voss joined him, his movements quiet. They're ready. Whatever comes next, they'll follow you. Kael's gaze didn't waver. They're not following me. They're fighting for something bigger than any one man. Voss let out a low chuckle. You always know how to kill the sentiment, don't you? Kael turned, his expression softening, if only slightly. We don't have the luxury of sentiment. The sound of boots echoed down the corridor as Trent approached, holding a datapad glowing with fresh intelligence. Admiral, the last transmission from the Empire's remnants confirms their leadership has retreated to the Sanctum Nebula. It's heavily fortified, but without their weapon, they'll be relying on standard defenses. Kael studied the datapad for a moment before handing it back. Standard defenses aren't enough to stop us. Trent hesitated, his voice dipping. Kael, this is it. If we fail here— We won't fail, Kael interrupted, his voice unshakable. We've come too far for failure. The fleet moved into position, their engines igniting like a constellation brought to life. The Sanctum Nebula loomed ahead, a swirling expanse of light and shadow, its natural beauty masking the danger within. As the ships pierced the edge of the nebula, the Empire's defenses came into view, massive warships bristling with weaponry, their forms outlined against the pulsing light. The comms crackled with the voice of an Empire commander, his tone dripping with disdain. Earth Fleet, this is your only warning. Turn back now, or face annihilation. Kael stepped to the comm station, his voice calm, deliberate. This is Admiral Kael Orion of the Vanguard Fleet. Your crimes are known, your power is waning, and your reign ends today. Surrender, or we will take what remains of your empire by force. There was a pause, followed by the laughter of the commander. Foolish humans. You've sealed your own fate. The transmission ended, and Kael turned to his officers. All ships, engage. The battle erupted with blinding intensity. Energy blasts lit up the nebula, casting jagged shadows across the chaos. The fleet moved with precision, each ship executing its role with flawless coordination. Kael directed the engagement from the bridge, his command sharp and unwavering. Target their command ship, he ordered. Cut off their coordination. The Resolute surged forward, its railguns firing in synchronized volleys. The enemy command ship shuddered under the assault, its shields flickering before collapsing. A final barrage tore through its hull, and it erupted in a plume of light and debris. Command ship neutralized, the tactical officer reported. Kael nodded, his focus shifting to the broader battle. The enemy fleet faltered, their movements losing cohesion as panic set in. Kael seized the advantage, directing his forces to press the attack. The Resolute led the final charge, its weapons carving a path through the remaining defenders. One by one, the Empire's ships fell, their forms disintegrating into the nebula's light. As the last enemy vessel exploded, a silence fell over the fleet, broken only by the faint crackle of damaged comms. Kael stepped back from the console, his breath steady but heavy with the weight of what had been achieved. The bridge crew watched him in silence, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and awe. It's done, Trent said softly. The Empire's hold is broken. Kael looked out at the remnants of the battle, his gaze distant. This isn't just about breaking their hold, it's about building something better. Voss clapped him on the shoulder, his grin returning. Then let's get started. Kael turned to face his officers, his voice rising with quiet power. Today we proved that humanity isn't a species to be underestimated. We're not just survivors. We're builders, fighters, creators, and when we're pushed, we push back. Hard. The crew erupted into cheers, their voices filling the bridge with a sense of triumph that carried across the fleet. Kael turned back to the viewport, his reflection faint against the swirling nebula. "The galaxy will remember today," he murmured, "not for what we destroyed, but for what we refused to become." As the Resolute moved away from the battlefield, the stars ahead seemed brighter, a silent promise of what was to come.